everybody, and welcome to Chapter 4. So in Chapter 4, we're going to be talking about body organization and homeostasis. We'll basically be talking about tissues that lead to organs, and then organ systems such as the skin, and then maintaining homeostasis. So looking at a tissue is a group of cells that work together to do a common function. Tissues will come together to make organs come together to make organ systems, as we talked about in Chapter 1. There's 4 major tissue types that exist in the body: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. A stomach, for example, the organ the stomach can have all 4 of these tissues in it. So starting off with your first types of tissues, you have epithelial tissue. This is on the outer surface of bodies. It also lines cavities and organs. So think about from mouth to anus, that slimy surface, that mucus surface that lines our respiratory tract, that lines the inside of our digestive tract. Epithelial tissue forms your glands. Think of like oil and sweat glands. Connective tissue, this is a supportive tissue. It's a very wide range of tissues. It can be anything from fat to blood to tendons, ligaments, cartilage, bone, but all of these provide a supportive type of mechanism. Muscle tissue, this is going to provide movement of the body or movement of fluids throughout the body, and nervous tissue is going to conduct nerve impulses. All right, so what we have, the first one we're going to talk about is epithelial tissue. And epithelial tissue contains a free surface. This is going to be exposed to the outside environment. Even if it's lining our respiratory tract or our GI tract, it is exposed to the environment. It's going to have cells that are going to be there for protection, secretion, or absorption. Now this will sit on, so you'll have these cells, and pretend like here is an epithelium. You'll have these cells. There's all sorts of different types of cells. And you will see this in lab when you learn about tissues. It will rest in what's called a basement membrane. And this basement membrane will allow diffusion of nutrients to the epithelium. Because your epithelium is avascular, you need to have sort of this ability to pass these nutrients through here. It also is going to provide some support, resist stretching. Now, there's different types of epithelial tissue, and it's based upon the cells that they contain. So we have squamous cells, which are going to be either flat-like cells, okay, cuboidal cells, these are cube-shaped cells, and column-shaped cells, they are longer than they are wider. Now, they can be arranged in one layer and be simple, or they can be in multiple layers, meaning a stratified type of epithelium. So squamous cells, when you have these flattened cells, this is going to allow materials to pass through easily. So when you see absorption, secretion, diffusion, and it's pretty much diffusion is going to be the main job of squamous cells. Cuboidal cells, these are specialized for secretion and absorption. A lot of cuboidal cells make the products that we secrete. So it makes the oil, it makes hormones too as well. A columnar is also kind of in the family of secretion and absorption. Columnar epithelium is very common along our digestive tract. And so you can see here, this is an image that has a nice little summary of where you find these types of epithelial tissue. All right, epithelial glands. You can either have 2 types of glands that exist. You can have exocrine or endocrine. Exocrine is going to use a duct. These are ducted glands. They're going to secrete onto a surface or an organ or a cavity. Exocrine glands are going to include, hold on, let me get my pen running. They're going to include sweat, oil, and even like with the pancreas, we have a pancreatic duct that releases enzymes into our gut. So a pancreatic duct. So they're going to use a duct to secrete their products. Endocrine, they're going to lack a duct. They call these ductless glands, and they're going to be predominantly hormones that's secreted into the space outside of cells. So think of like what's called interstitial space, or even into our bloodstream. And connective tissue, moving on to our next type of tissue. This is the most common, most abundant. It's got fibers. These fibers can be collagen, elastic, or reticular fibers. It's got ground substance. So it may be like with bone, you can have fibers that are in a solid ground substance. Blood would be a fluid. That's like the plasma. Cartilage is more of a gelatinous type. It's kind of like when you think about plants, and plants have roots in the dirt. It's the dirt that surrounds the roots. So it's very supportive. It makes up the structural framework. Now there's connective tissue proper, and then there's specialized tissue groups. Connective tissue proper gets further divided into a loose or a dense connective tissue. The loose is like areolar and adipose tissue. At areolar connective tissue, this is kind of like a filler tissue. You find it between your organs. It binds your organs. Adipose tissue is fat tissue. This is going to cushion and provide insulation. A dense connective tissue, this is going to be found in a more, it's not going to be as, the fibers are more tightly packed, so to say. So ligaments, tendons, and then the dermis, which is your middle layer of your skin. So more tightly packed fibers. Specialized connective tissue is going to be cartilage, bone, and blood. Cartilage, it's strong, but it does have flexibility. It does have a gelatinous type of material that supports it. There's 3 types of cartilage. The most common being hyaline cartilage. This is the cartilage that's found at the ends of your long bones that provides our joint surfaces. Elastic cartilage, this is like your ears. Fibrocartilage, these are like discs in between your knees, like they're called menisci, or discs in between your vertebra called intervertebral discs. Bone is going to support and protect our internal organs. Think about your skull protects your brain. Your rib cage supports your lungs and your heart. Not only does it do protection, but it attaches muscles attached to bone for movement. It can also store fats and minerals like calcium and phosphates. And then in certain areas of bone, we have red blood cell and white blood cell and platelet cell production. It's called hematopoiesis. And so when you talk about getting a bone marrow biopsy, you're taking a sample of all your baby blood cells and seeing if they're doing okay. So bone marrow is where you have blood cell production going on, and it occurs in your bones. Blood is part of the connective tissue family. It's a liquid connective tissue. The fluid portion of blood is your plasma. And then you have blood cells. They're called formed elements. These are red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And many other things are transported in your plasma, such as sugars, antibodies, other types of proteins too as well. Okay, so moving on to our third type of tissue, this is muscle tissue. We're grouped into 3 parts. We have skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Skeletal is going to be our typical biceps, brachii. When you go to the gym and you look at all the machines, you're looking at which muscles you want to work out. That's going to be skeletal muscle. It is under our control, so it's voluntary contraction. Cardiac muscle and smooth muscle, this is involuntary, so it's under subconscious control. Cardiac muscle is going to be found in the wall of your heart, and its job is to allow the heart to push blood out, so it's a heart pump. Smooth muscles is going to be lining the walls of hollow organs. So this is going to include blood vessels. Your blood vessels have the ability to get smaller or get bigger. That's called vasoconstriction or vasodilation. Your bronchial tree, these are your airways. You have the ability to do what's called bronchoconstriction or bronchodilation. And then your GI tract. Your GI tract is going to be pushing food from mouth to anus. And so that term is called peristalsis when you do that. So that is the twisting and turning of that wall due to smooth muscle to push that food down. Nervous tissue, our final and last tissue, is made up of neurons. These are amitotic, means they don't divide. And neuroglia or glial cells, these do divide. They do undergo cell division. They're supportive cells. Neurons, you get what you get, okay? When you're born with them, they do have extreme longevity, but if you damage them, they cannot regenerate. And so these neurons are your nerve cells. They're going to generate nerve impulses. It allows our brain to communicate with our muscle cells, our glands, and parts with our body. Neuroglial cells, they're going to support and protect those neurons. All right, now cells can be connected to other cells via junctions. There's 3 types of junctions. You have what's called tight junctions. These are a leak-proof seal. The intestines, like the stomach. I had mentioned earlier when we were talking about pH that the pH of the stomach is like a 1 to 3. You don't want any of that stomach fluid leaking out into outer surrounding tissues. That could be very dangerous. So the stomach has tight junctions. Adhesion junctions, these are also called desmosomes. These can be found between skin cells. These allow a little bit more of a stretching. And gap junctions, these are like tunnels. They have little holes connecting cells together. And these are found between cardiac muscle cells. These allow nerve impulses to travel between cells very quickly and efficiently. Okay, so organs are composed of 2 or more different tissues that perform a specific function, and organs will come together to form organ systems. Now, epithelium, supported by connective tissues called membranes, these line our body cavities. We have a couple different types of membrane examples here. You have mucous membranes. So this would line from mouth to anus, your mouth to anus tube. So if you're doing an endoscope or a colonoscopy scope, your first thing that you would encounter is this mucus-like substance. This is the epithelium there. Also, your respiratory tract is lined with mucous membranes too as well. Serous membranes, these surround your thoracic cavity, your abdominal cavity, and the organs within them. It basically is a double layer membrane that has fluid in between it so these organs can move. Synovial membranes, these line joints, freely movable joints, most common joints that we think about, shoulder, knee, and that synovial fluid that's in there, it can decline with age, leading to destruction of the cartilage, the hyaline cartilage, as we talked about before, at the ends of our long bones. So synovial membranes produce synovial fluid, and synovial fluid is a very important component of healthy joints. Cutaneous membrane, that is our skin. It has called cutaneous because it has receptors in it. So temperature receptors, pain receptors, touch receptors, and so forth. Here's all our body systems. You definitely want to go through this. This gives you a nice summary. We will cover all of these in the chapters that we discuss throughout the class here. So these give you a nice little summary about what each of these systems do. When we look about our organs, they are in these body cavities. So our ventral body cavity, this is going to include our thoracic cavity and our abdominal cavity. Sometimes they call that an abdominal pelvic cavity. And then you have what's called your dorsal cavity, and your dorsal cavity is going to include your cranial cavity and your spinal cavity, including your brain and your spinal cord. All right, so the first organ system that we're going to get into in this chapter is going to be the integumentary system, which is the skin. It's about 5 to 6% of our body weight, so it does make a big contribution to that. Other parts of the skin will include hair, nails, sweat glands, oil glands, and wax glands. Wax glands, where do we find wax glands? We actually find it in our ear. It is the largest organ in our body. It protects against invasion, UV radiation, physical things. There's a protein in our skin called keratin, so that has a physical protection. Chemical, there's many antimicrobial, basically like antibacterial properties of our skin. There's lipids in our skin that prevent water loss. We can either divert blood flow towards our skin or away from our skin to regulate body temperature. Our skin takes sunlight and combines it with cholesterol to make vitamin D, which is really important for the absorption of calcium in our gut. And we receive stimuli. Just as I said previously, our skin is a cutaneous membrane, so it has all sorts of receptors for touch, pain, temperature, etc. Our skin is divided into 3 layers. Some people actually consider one of the layers not a layer, but we're going to talk about it as 3. The 3 layers of the skin is the epidermis, which is what faces our outside environment. The middle layer is the dermis. It's very thick. It contains connective tissue. Our hypodermis is our innermost layer, and this is going to contain connective tissue and fat. All right. And I should say fat is a connective tissue, so a loose connective tissue right here, which includes fat and areolar connective tissue. And so looking at the epidermis first, this outer surface, part of it is made up of dead cells, and the deepest layer is made up of dividing cells. So the layer that's closest to the dermis is made up of rapidly dividing cells, and as these cells move up in their layers, they progressively die. So if we look at the layer of the epidermis, you're going to see actively dividing cells. And then as they push their way up, they basically become flat and they die off. And you can flake some of these cells off very easily. And so this top layer here is made up of dead skin cells. But these cells down here, these are the stem cells, and this is where they divide from and form there. It's about a 4 to 6 week journey going from here up. This is through the layers. Remember, the epidermis is avascular. So if you think about it, when you scratch some of these top layers of cells, you're not bleeding profusely. But if you do get into the dermis, which is below it, all right, then it would bleed profusely and potentially cause permanent damage. So the dermis supports the epidermis because it has blood supply in there. So you have blood vessels, nerves, glands. This is where all your sweat glands and oil glands and your hair follicles, this is where your hair grows from. And so it does not wear away. It gives some flexibility. So flexibility and strength is due to the collagen and elastic fibers in it. Below the dermis is going to be the hypodermis, also called the subcutaneous layer. This is going to anchor your skin to muscles or other tissues underneath it. Most of the time it's muscle that's found underneath it. It has a lot of fat in it, so it can be very much involved with temperature and fat storage, also providing protection. Like I said, some books do not consider this part of the skin. So this is a nice view here showing our layers here. So our outermost layers are epidermis. You can see this sort of transition from here to here. These are the dead cells. And then looking at our dermis is our biggest portion right here. You've got blood vessels, you've got glands, you've got your hair follicles right here. And then our last innermost layer is our hypodermis, which is predominantly fat. So skin color can be determined by blood flow and also pigments. So as we have changes in blood flow, if blood flows away, we're going to get more of a bluish whitish tint that's called cyanosis or cyanotic. As you get blood flow towards it, you can get what's called a hyperemia. That's an increased blood flow to the tissue, to the skin, and that would produce like a redness color. The amount of melanin that you have, we all have the same amount of cells called melanocytes, but the amount of melanin that you produce is genetically determined. And so it could either be a lot of melanin that will give you a darker skin, less melanin will give you more of a yellower to red type of skin. UV rays stimulate melanin production, increase the production of it. So as you can see, when you go out in the sun, your skin may get a tan color, and that would be to increase production in response to those UV rays. Now, the other structures that we find in the epidermis coming through here is going to be hair, nails, oil, sweat glands, wax glands. Teeth will be covered in the digestive system. So your hair is really there for protection. By the time you see it out of your body, its root is found in the dermis. By the time you see it out of the body, it's pretty much dead. So the shaft extends above the skin surface. The root is below into the dermis or the hypodermis. Nails, these protect our toes and our fingers. Part of it is dead as the closer you get towards the root of where it is. This is where you'd have rapidly dividing cells. But most of what we see of our nails is dead skin-like tissue. Oil glands, we find that everywhere in the body except for the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. Oil glands predominantly lubricate our skin and our hair, so we find it attached to our hair follicles. They also have antimicrobial type components. Sweat helps with temperature regulation, and in sweat we have waste products, so that is a release of waste products. Wax glands, these are called ceruminous glands. They produce a wax that helps trap dirt and debris in the ear canal. The UV radiation that hits our skin, it causes the melanocytes to increase their metabolism, so their production of melanin. Also, UV rays can damage our DNA, okay, and so it can cause cancer. There's 3 types of skin cancer. The most common type that we come across is basal cell carcinoma. When we have a mole of some sort, and it's usually non-malignant, not always, but usually, that means that it's not likely to travel to other places. So a malignancy is when you have a tumor that's a highly malignant tumor is something that divides rapidly and likely to travel to other places. And when it travels, that's called metastasize. The second most common is squamous cell carcinoma. This is rapidly growing, but it can be treatable. Melanoma is the least common, but it is the most dangerous. It can travel to other places such as the lungs, and it can be very deadly. Obviously, to prevent skin cancer, you want to avoid the sun for long periods of time, wear sunscreen, and avoid tanning salons. When we talk about acne, this is associated with the hair follicles and the oil glands associated with that. During your teenage years, you have hormones that increase and decrease at abnormal times. And by increasing male hormones, especially in males, androgens, they cause the oil glands to produce more sebum, which is the oily secretion that is produced from there. And so they get clogged, and you get inflammation of the glands, and you got dead cells in there. And so that is where you get acne from. And so a lot of people think that it's diet, but a lot of it is actually genetics. There's a lot of it is genetics and hormone related. All right, so this is an important concept here. We have what's called homeostasis. Homeostasis is this body's ability to constantly strive to maintain normalcy. And normalcy in organs is different. For example, we talked about the pH. The pH of blood is a very narrow range of 7.35 to 7.45, whereas the pH of your the pH of your stomach is a 1 to 3. So whatever the body does to maintain that normalcy can be different from organ to organ. And so when we look at what's called negative feedback mechanisms, this is our measures to return that organ back to its normal rate, that normal value. Positive feedback mechanism, this promotes a continued change in that direction away from normalcy. So the best example when we talk about a negative feedback mechanism is going to be, let's look at this image right here. You have some sort of receptor. Let's say this is a change in temperature. Let's say we have a temperature change. We sense that it's cold. Our skin has thermal receptors in there. It senses that it's cold. This sends messages up through the control center. Pretty much most of the control center is going to be our brain. The brain makes a decision to start contracting our skeletal muscle. So we have what's called shivering. The byproduct of shivering is the increase in heat. Okay, when muscles contract, a byproduct of it is heat. So now we restore to normal levels. Okay, we restore our temperature to normal levels. We could go in the opposite direction. We could be too hot. Brain says start sweating, and that would cause heat to evaporate from our sweat glands. And so we've got thermoreceptors. We just gave that example of hyperthermia and hypothermia. And so I didn't give an example here. We don't have a picture of a positive feedback mechanism, but a positive feedback mechanism, an example of this would be uterine contractions. There are times when positive feedback mechanisms sort of need to play a role. So the uterus contracting is not normal. But when you're having a baby, you have a hormone called oxytocin that keeps causing more and more and higher levels of uterine contraction to push a baby out. Blood clotting. Blood clotting is also another example of a positive feedback mechanism. You shouldn't be blood clotting all the time, but there are times when you have tissue injury and where you do need to have blood clotting. So most of the body works to maintain normalcy in a negative feedback mechanism. There are times when we do need positive, but not always. And that is it for Chapter 4.